Alright, me. It is late June, and I've just finished reading How Lincoln Learned to Read by Daniel Wolff. How I came to own this book is that this was initially for my History of American Education class. And we paid so much money for this book, which I'll get to in a second of why. And then we read 2 chapters of it, and that was it. So kind of disappointing on that end, but certainly, in of itself is actually a very good book. It's just that the circumstances of the book itself is not the greatest. The reason why it was so expensive is because I believe you can't actually get this book anymore. My understanding, talking to Lausen, the instructor for the class, is that he found the book and was using the book for this class, and then he discontinued it. But he loved the book so much that somehow, and he explained this very, very quickly to me, so I probably don't have all the exact things correct, but he managed to convince IU to get the publishing rights for the book, of something of that sort, right? So then because of that, we were then paying the price of a full textbook for what should have been a $10 book, which is not the greatest, but How Lincoln Learned to Read is really a collection of stories that are based around 12 or 13 different U.S. citizens throughout life. Yes, Kat. I'm glad once again you decided to start doing this as soon as I start talking, you idiot. Is looking at 12 to 13 American citizens throughout life and about how they came to be educated in some way, right? Or in their path to education. And we focus on quite a diverse cast of individuals. A lot are politicians or related to politicians, but then we do get some people that are, like the very last one is Elvis, right? And it's an interesting combination of people. But really what the focus is on, right, is that the idea and the concept that education occurs well beyond just the classroom, right? Is that in the early days before public education was really even a concept that existed, was that many people received education throughout different ways, right? And for a lot of people, right, as seen and described, is that for a lot of people they were able to have privatized education in some way, that they came from a rich enough background, or that they displayed enough early on that some other family that had wealth was then willing to pay for them to have this private education. But we also see is that for quite a few of them, right, is that we see that their education and with how they learn to do things really comes from experiences that you can't necessarily have in a classroom, right? And so it's this kind of back and forth on this. One of the things that constantly gets described, which I don't agree with, right, is that so many of these people in their own writings describe that their public education or given education by the state institution was not worth anything, that it was unremarkable in every single way. But what we also see is that consistently the things that they were directly taught in that setting, right, whether it be what they were actually taught or the social situation that they were taught, then directly affect what they end up doing in their life, right? So it's one of those things where like education sometimes, even if we don't admit it or aren't necessarily aware of it, does come from an effect in a lot of different ways, right? But yeah. Really the main thing that I took out of this, right? I think certainly the main point I would argue that Daniel Wolff's trying to make is that, right, we need to allow students and allow children to have a lot of these outside experiences and follow what they like and learn what they can from that. The problem is of course, is that there are a lot of, I guess, in looking at that in a modern sense, in a modern context, right, in which we have the access to all the information in the world at our hands, is that people don't necessarily actively go out to seek and to learn, right, until often it's too late, right? Or it's this concept of, because we have so much, we don't need to do anything. But then that creates this vicious cycle of where now we suddenly have less, and then we have less, and then we have less, and now all of a sudden we're scrambling back up to meet this thing, this standard that we've set of our life expectations, and we can't do it, right? So certainly, I think this book was published in like 2009. Wolff's, I think, philosophy more or less kind of ends up falling apart once you look at it in a modern context, but I certainly do understand the idea behind it, right? But it also shows a huge issue in the way that we look at public education right now, which is that because of this ideology, right? And this ideology is really kind of possessed of itself, right? The state of Indiana very recently has put forward a really, really big push in terms of getting kids career and technical education, and making part of that, I don't think it's a requirement for education, but certainly I think for Core 40, I think that is now technically a requirement for that, what is technically the second lowest degree, I think, right, is that you need to have some sort of career training, whether that be for college or for an actual career. The problem is that these things cost money, right? One of the things and one of the benefits that is kind of brushed over throughout Daniel Wolff's whole thing is that there's a huge economic factor here, right? And that, even the people that are described, like Sojourner Truth, who certainly do not have money and do not have access, would not necessarily have access to things, are put into circumstances in which they have someone else who has money that is then willing to give them things, right? And it's a huge constant issue of this, right? And now, because this sort of ideology of the home, or it's the farm by, is that Thoreau? Whatever it is, of where what you learn and how you live life is most often learned at home. Well, then we can't have those things anymore at home because we don't have enough of a population that works those types of jobs anymore, right? Because most of our jobs, we're no longer in a labor economy, we are in a service economy, right? So it no longer makes sense for that to be it. But now we just pass it off to the school, and the school now has to, or I guess public education has to somehow now also provide the farm education, but they're also doing it with way less money than they ever have, right? It's a consistent losing situation in terms of what public education is expected to provide and be able to provide to a population of students, but then also do it with less and less money, because we're not seeing what we want out of it. But we're not seeing what we want out of it because we're not getting the funding for it. And because we're not getting the funding for it, we're not going to get the funding for it. So we're not going to get the funding for it. So we're not going to get the funding for it. Right? It's a consistent issue that it, like, for whatever reason, it just doesn't get seen, or people just don't want to admit that that's the issue. But yeah. So that's all that. That's How Lincoln Learned to Read by Daniel Wolff. Yeah.